On this Saturday night, closing in on Kyiv. Russian forces inch closer to the Ukrainian capital and are accused of bombing a mosque and killing children in the south. The violence sparking fresh calls for peace talks.
We are ready to negotiate, but we are not going to accept any ultimatums and surrender.
Plus, how the conflict is fueling soaring costs in Canada. Pig problems. Why this invasive species is sparking concerns from environmentalists and Canadian pork producers. And turning red. How the Canadian behind Pixar's new hit movie is inspiring a new generation.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. It was another deadly day in Ukraine. Russian forces bombarding villages around the capital and claiming new territory in the south. Ukraine's president says some 1,300 Ukrainian troops have died since the fighting began. But as those casualties mount, the Ukrainian government insists it will not surrender. Abigail Bimman begins our coverage tonight.
Bombing intensifies closer and closer to the Ukrainian capital. Peaceful civilians, we weren't doing a thing, this man says, struggling to understand why his village was destroyed. According to British intelligence, Russian ground forces are just 25 kilometers from Kyiv.
We are ready to negotiate, but we are not going to accept any ultimatums and surrender.
I'm highly skeptical that the Russians will be able to take Kyiv.
Simon Miles says munitions coming from NATO allies, including Canada's anti-tank weapon systems, will make a difference in the house-to-house and street fighting he expects to see.
Those types of weapons deployed in houses overlooking streets are going to be able to do an extraordinary amount of damage to a Russian invading force, which is going to be perennially, sort of perpetually needing to watch out for shadows in windows.
Meanwhile, in the south along the border, Ukraine says Russia has captured Mariupol's eastern edges. I don't know where to run. Who will bring back our children? This mother asks, clutching one child, another killed by shelling. There are reports a mosque sheltering more than 80 people, including children, was hit too. According to the city council, nearly 1,600 civilians in the encircled city have been killed. Buses line up to try and bring aid, a complicated mission, while the UN is worried about reports of looting and violence out of desperation for supplies. Ukraine's first deputy prime minister visits a train station in Poland, trying to plan a route to get more water, food, and medicine into her country fast.
We don't have weeks or months. And that's why we need this assistance right now. We need your help today.
Of course, more than 2 million Ukrainians have already left their country.
I can't speak without tears. I'm sorry, but I'm really sorry for my country, and nobody could expect this, really. This is awfully awful things.
While others don't want to leave, volunteers help evacuate Irpin, a city right next to Kyiv.
They don't see the future for them, that nobody is waiting for them anywhere, so they want to stay there. But we are trying to tell them that you guys have to leave everything and run.
Leave everything and run, afraid of what may come next if they don't. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
Meanwhile, the leaders of France and Germany spoke today with the Russian president, hoping to secure a ceasefire. But a French government official said that Vladimir Putin did not show a willingness to end the war. It comes as U.S. President Joe Biden ramps up trade and economic sanctions against Russia. But as Jennifer Johnson reports, those sanctions are also having an impact far beyond Russia's borders.
U.S. President Joe Biden squeezing Russia's economy even tighter, now banning imports of big-ticket Russian products like caviar and diamonds, and stopping exports of U.S. luxury goods, high-end cars and watches, desired by President Vladimir Putin's billionaire backers.
They support Putin. They steal from the Russian people.
Deutsche Bank has now joined hundreds of companies across the globe pulling its business out of Russia. But Putin continues to brush off the impact of sanctions as he ramps up deadly attacks in Ukraine.
I think the main idea is to kill Ukrainians as much as they can.
The Biden administration is under growing pressure from 40 Republican senators to change course and get Poland's MiG fighter jets into Ukraine, even if that means through a U.S. military base.
We've gone from incompetent by the Biden administration to this move is dishonorable.
President Biden still has more economic weapons he could launch at Russia, including directly sanctioning its stock market and the country's largest state-owned banks. But actions have ripple effects, including skyrocketing gas prices in the U.S. after America stopped buying Russian oil.
Can you get me a loan?
It was over $50.
Airline ticket prices are rapidly rising, too, as the cost of jet fuel surges. And the U.S. is facing another crisis from the war, dozens of Ukrainian refugees flying to Mexico to try and get into America.
I don't have any other place to go. I have family and friends in USA, and they're ready to support me.
But the U.S. border is still officially closed to asylum seekers due to COVID-19 restrictions. After multiple attempts, a few Ukrainians are getting through to have their cases heard.
Right now we have a trickle that's turning into a stream that's going to turn into a flood.
The UN says more than 2.5 million Ukrainians have fled their country since the war began. Next week, the president will sign a spending bill giving Ukraine nearly $14 billion in military and humanitarian aid. But many lawmakers and Americans watching Ukraine crumble under Russia's attacks say it's not enough. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
And as Jennifer mentioned, the war in Ukraine is fueling record gas prices around the world, including here in Canada. And there are now growing calls for governments to help provide some relief at the pumps. That topic is topping the agenda on this week's edition of The West Block with our chief political correspondent, David Akin. David.
Well, Jeff, you know, lots of people right across the country took note of the action taken by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney this week when he announced that in response to the rise in energy prices, his government is going to cut the amount of tax on a liter of gas, and starting April 1st will provide a rebate of $150 on electricity bills. And that is essentially returning some of the windfall profits that his government is taking in with oil selling north of $100 a barrel. Now, the federal government will also be seeing higher revenues because of soaring oil prices. And so I asked Federal Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson if his government might consider a similar rebate program to help ease the pain of pump prices.
I recognize that this is a big challenge for many Canadians, and we need to figure out what the best way to actually address that is. It certainly can be in terms of pushing forward with encouraging people to utilize zero-emission vehicles and those kinds of things, which are not nearly as sensitive to the price. It certainly can involve a look at the windfall profits that the oil and gas sector is actually making during this period of time.
We also have former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz on the program, and he cautions that markets themselves tend to have a way of bringing oil prices back down to earth.
High oil prices usually are their own cure, right? Because they destroy demand, and that causes people to drive less, etc. And also would normally prompt a supply response. And so usually high oil prices don't last that long.
One thing we have heard from federal politicians, there will be no pause on the scheduled increase to the federal carbon tax. That's going up April 1st. The Trudeau government, though, could look at other policies that might make it into this year's federal budget. And it is a budget that we expect to be tabled in April. Jeff.
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. And there are fears Moldova, which borders Ukraine to the west, could also be pulled into the war. Moldova is home to a sizable minority sympathetic to Moscow. It also has a breakaway republic that remains under the control of pro-Russian rebels. And that's where more than 1,000 Russian troops are stationed right now. Mercedes Stephenson reports.
Moldova is a small country under enormous geopolitical pressure, facing an influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine and the fear it could be next on Russia's hit list.
We are nowadays, Ukraine and ourselves are on the border between Russia and the West, and we need the support to be able to maintain this stability. It's in everyone's interest.
The country is teetering with economic challenges and political divides that are being exacerbated by the building humanitarian crisis, and the situation could rapidly become critical without more help soon.
I don't even want to consider that scenario. It's dire.
There is fear in Moldova that they may be next after Ukraine. The country is not a NATO member, and unlike Ukraine, it has a very small military, around 5,000 people. Some here believe that Putin will test the West by trying Moldova next. Publicly, officials insist that everything is fine, and there's rare unity in messaging between the opposition and the government, who fear triggering domestic unrest.
Russians have strategically destabilized this country for the better part of 3 decades.
There is also concerns that any sign of instability here could give the Russians an excuse to invade.
To create a raison d'être for Russians to interfere, to save Russian people in Moldova.
There are already Russian troops on Moldovan soil in the rebel breakaway Republic of Transnistria, a self-declared country that is not even recognized by Russia, but heavily supported by it.
This is one of the main factors of risk to Moldovan national security.
Transnistria even has its own military, and it's the same size as Moldova's. Intelligence analysts believe Russian troops could come back through Transnistria to attack Odessa in Ukraine or Moldova. We tried to go to Transnistria to see what's happening there, but we were stopped at the border.
So we just tried to cross over into Transnistria. That was unsuccessful. They saw our cameras in the back. Typically television crews not allowed in, and clearly we fell into that category. Essentially what happened is we pulled up, they took our passports, went in, they were gone for a while. We're not sure what they were doing at that point, possibly trying to search, figure out who we are, but we do have a drone and we do have cameras in the back, and of course we also have press ID. We don't hide the fact that we're journalists with clearly the materials that we have on us. So they did not allow us to enter, but it was quite interesting because we were able to see people in their Transnistrian uniforms. This is a breakaway republic. It is not internationally recognized, but you could see they're organized.
Even though we didn't get very far, we did see evidence of the Russian peacekeeping troops stationed there. Behind that green fence is a Russian armored personnel carrier. Mercedes Stephenson, Global News, Chisinau.
In other news, Saudi Arabia has carried out the largest mass execution in modern history, killing 81 prisoners. The state-run Saudi press agency says those executed today were convicted of various crimes, including murder. Meanwhile, prominent Saudi blogger Raif Badawi is finally free after 10 years in prison. But the Saudi regime says he can't leave the kingdom for a decade. Badawi was imprisoned on charges of insulting Islam back in 2012. He was released on Friday with a 10-year travel ban, and he's also barred from using social media during that time. Under those conditions, Badawi won't be able to travel to be with his wife and 3 children who live in Quebec. They were granted asylum in Canada following his arrest. Still ahead, nearly 2 years since one of Canada's worst shooting sprees, an inquiry gets set to hear testimony from the gunman's former partner. A powerful storm is sweeping across the eastern U.S. and Atlantic coast, bringing up to 15 centimeters of snow in some spots. Environment Canada says areas near the water could also see up to 60 millimeters of rain by the time the system passes through. Well, it was one of Canada's worst shooting sprees. Nearly 2 years ago, 22 people died in Portapique, Nova Scotia, when a gunman went on a rampage. The public inquiry examining that tragedy will resume at the end of this month, and we'll hear from 3 RCMP officers who responded. As Ross Lord reports, the commissioners also plan to call the person who knew the gunman best.
As the common law partner of a man who killed 22 people, Lisa Banfield will be a key witness at the public inquiry into the Portapique massacre.
She's a very important part of what happened that night and an important part for the process as well.
The gunman, Gabriel Wortman, disguised himself as an RCMP officer, killing 13 neighbors while setting houses on fire, including his own.
Just to let you guys know, we're now getting reports that there's possibly multiple victims, fatalities.
After slipping past RCMP officers who responded in Portapic, he murdered 9 more people the next day before police killed him. The massacre started after Wortman assaulted Banfield, and she escaped into the woods. Lawyers for victims' families say it's crucial for Banfield to tell the inquiry everything she saw and heard.
So we anticipate that we will hear from her, and as with other witnesses, under a subpoena.
Security analysts caution Banfield's testimony is only one piece of an enormous body of evidence being collected by the Mass Casualty Commission.
And we have to measure to what extent someone's testimony is likely only going to replicate information that the commission already has by other means.
Banfield has been questioned several times by RCMP investigators, telling them the killer was controlling, physically abusive, and that he'd told her over the years, "When I go out, I'm going out with a bang." But she said she never anticipated he'd kill anyone, let alone embark on a diabolical rampage. Other witnesses make similar observations, including the killer's uncle, a retired RCMP officer who thought when he gave him these police boots and other clothing, they'd be used for home decor, not as part of a systematic slaughter that's left a trail of trauma across Nova Scotia. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
Coming up, feral swine bomb, the invasive species sparking concerns over their potential to spread disease.
You're watching Global National.
Welcome back. It's being called a ticking swine bomb. Millions of wild pigs are reproducing, spreading, and eating their way across North America. For the New Reality this week, Candace Daniel explores the growing environmental and financial cost on both sides of the border. Candace.
They have the ability to cause considerable damage in a short amount of time. Wild pigs are an invasive species and pose a serious threat, so much so that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has called the problem a feral swine bomb. They have the potential to cause catastrophic economic and ecological harm. In the U.S. alone, causing more than $2.5 billion in damages every year. Rachel Sharp manages her family's seed farm in South Carolina. They have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to feral pigs.
It is so disheartening to spend so much time and so much money putting a crop in the ground and then seeing it come up and look okay and go back the next day and it's completely mowed down.
In addition to crop and property damage, wild hogs also carry diseases and harmful bacteria.
So they can serve as a reservoir for African swine fever. So the big concern is these wild pigs getting infected, moving closer to the areas of domestic production and then transmitting it, which would require the complete elimination of those domestic herds.
African swine fever, or ASF, is a viral disease with a high mortality rate for swine. The concern in Canada is if it gets into the wild or domestic pig population here, the borders could close. For Canadian pork producers like Jurgen Preichus, this would not only devastate his farm, but hurt the entire industry too.
If you have wild pigs like this come onto your yard and then whatever disease they may be carrying transmits to our animals, then it puts the whole industry at risk.
The Canadian government says the pork industry generates upwards of $24 billion to the economy every year. Experts are also researching ways to effectively control the feral swine population and are urging action to be taken now.
Candace Daniel in Toronto. Thanks, Candace. And you can watch Candace's full story on the impacts of invasive wild pigs. That's tonight on The New Reality, right here on Global. Coming up, how an Oscar-winning Canadian filmmaker is inspiring the next generation of animators. Welcome back. Award-winning Toronto filmmaker Domi Shi is blazing a trail in the world of animation. Her latest film, called Turning Red, is generating plenty of buzz, with fans praising the latest Pixar blockbuster after its debut yesterday. She calls the project a love letter to the city she grew up in. And now she's returning to her roots to inspire the next generation. Kayla McLean has her story.
I'm Maylin Lee,
It's a coming-of-age film about a Chinese-Canadian girl who turns into a panda. A love letter to the 416, full of Toronto touchstones, the CN Tower, TTC streetcars, and Toronto's Chinatown.
It was my first time living outside of Canada.
Now Domi Shi, the Toronto creator of the Pixar film Turning Red, has come back home to give advice to her younger self. 400 animation students from Sheridan College packing this auditorium in Oakville to hear one of their own speak.
It's awe-inspiring to see somebody that graduated in 2011, 10 years out of school, directing a film that I think is going to be a huge hit.
Michelle Hannon, who taught Shi animation at Sheridan, says she's watched her former student soar, winning an Oscar for her short film Bao, and now becoming the first Asian woman to direct a Pixar feature film.
I think any student right now that sees similarities in themselves with her will feel like some doors and gates or whatever she had said are opening.
I see her succeed, and now I feel like I can do that.
For third-year stop-motion student Seema Nassim, it's the diversity in Shi's work that stands out. The Toronto she knows, but doesn't always see on the big screen.
The first time I ever saw a Pixar movie with people of color was made by Domi Shi, and that really inspired me because I'm Pakistani, Canadian. I grew up in Toronto too.
Shi's Turning Red not only puts Canada on the animation map, but a spotlight on homegrown talent too, starring Canadian darlings like Maitreyi Ramakrishnan.
We were just at the CN Tower.
Even Sandra Oh.
Toronto was never the it spot in media.
She, being unapologetically Canadian in her work, is a point that Cassius appreciates.
I'm so thankful that now with Turning Red, kids can see the CN Tower, they can see the Sky Dome. I know that if I was a kid right now and I was watching this, I'd be so proud to be from Toronto, Canada.
Keila McLean, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Saturday. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight, your Canada is near Wycliffe, BC. And don't forget that it's time to spring forward for daylight time. That's everywhere except in Saskatchewan. So remember to set your clocks ahead 1 hour before you go to bed and expect to feel extra tired tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you back here tomorrow. Have a great night.